Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
A global poll has found that in 2025, China surpassed the United States in approval ratings on leadership, and by the largest margin in nearly 2 decades. What's driving this change? How are global attitudes toward these two major powers evolving? And what could the shift mean for policymakers and for the future of the international order? Hello and welcome to the panel discussion of World Today. I'm Hongyu in Beijing. A poll conducted by U.S. analytics company Gallup found that China's global approval rating has climbed to a median of 36%, surpassing the United States at 31%. The 5-point gap marks the widest lead China has held over the U.S. in nearly 20 years of tracking. The shift reflects a decline in U.S. ratings alongside an increase for China. Approval of U.S. leadership fell from 39% in 2024 to 31%, while that of China rose from 32 to 36%. These findings are based on surveys across over 130 countries and regions, drawing on about 1,000 respondents in each. Now, joining us online for the discussion are Chen Weihua, former chief Washington correspondent of China Daily, Wang Chen, Deputy Secretary General at the Center for China and Globalization, and Li Pei-mei, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the International Islamic University, Malaysia. Welcome to the show. Well, the surveys were conducted in 2025, which means they were all before what has happened this year. They were before the recent round of Middle East conflict involving the United States, Israel, and Iran, and the ratings were before the recent escalating tensions between the United States and other NATO members. This is very important to note because people were making those ratings without these in mind. So first, let's go to Mr. Chen because you had been in the United States for quite a lot of years. Within just 1 year, global approval of the U.S. leadership fell from 39% to 31%. What happened?
I think I just want to make a few points. I think there was number one. I mean, we all know even Trump, before Trump took office earlier last year, he already threatened tariff war against the entire world. I mean, that's what he has been doing the first year. I mean, literally against not just China, but U.S. allies in Europe and Latin American country. I mean, neighbor Mexico, Canada. So it's U.S. has proved to be it's a disruptive source and destructive in some way power. And second, I would say, I mean, the U.S. has become a disruptive power of the global system. I mean, we always say the U.S. helped build the global system after the Second World War. But the first year of the Trump administration obviously proved that's not the case. I mean, the U.S. has been dismantling the global system with obviously not just the tariff war, just sort of the disabled the WTO. I mean, actually starting the first Trump administration already. I mean, the Trump administration withdrew, I mean, from Paris Climate Accord again for the second time. So all these, I think, are the main factor. I mean, which I think really, I actually just came back from 7 years in Europe. I mean, the views about the United States has declined dramatically because the Europeans cared a great deal about the climate change, and they are for a multipolar war. I mean, of course, they used to be pampered a lot. They relied so much on the U.S., but they thought by pleasing the U.S., U.S. might spare them from this tariff war. But the Trump administration, obviously, they're being very harsh on Europe too. So I just, that's the quick thought.
Okay, thank you. And then, Mr. Wang, what do you think are the factors driving the drop of global approval of the U.S. leadership in 2025?
Well, thank you for having me. I think what happened is that, in the eyes of many countries, the United States began to look less like a provider of stability and more like a source of disruption. The poll shows, the drop was broad-based, not confined to, rival states, the sort of countries that just inherently unfriendly to the United States. So it's very broad based. The U.S. approval fell from I think 39% to 31%, and its disapproval hit a record 48%. And the decline was especially sharp among its allies, as Mr. Chen Weihua just mentioned. I think this suggests the problem is not simply, anti-American ideology. It is growing discomfort with unpredictability. And as you correctly highlighted, the survey was actually conducted for the year of 2025. But since the survey year, which is, since the beginning of 2026, I would imagine that impression has only become easier to understand with the US, moving to withdraw from international organizations, and especially the recent US-Israeli attack on Iran. I think all these events will further reinforce concerns about unilateralism and global instability. So I would say, it's the decline reflects a cumulative loss of trust. Many countries still recognize U.S. power, but they increasingly doubt, it's the power's consistency, restraint, and reliability.
Then, Dr. Lee, what do you think?
Yeah, I think both panelists, Mr. Chen and Mr. Wang, point out a lot of very important points. I think one of the very important reason is the tariff. Another reason that I want to expand on, which they have yet to expand more on it, is about the American first policies. I mean, if we look at the tool used by the US to advance its American first policy, which is the tariff, it's actually telling the world that, all the measures or any actions or policies coming from the United States will be for US and it's not for the world. And this is actually depart from the previous administration of the US, where they always do things with their allies, in partnership with other countries and with their allies. So they provide a more multilateral system in the previous administration. But this round, under Trump, he's very unilateral. He's taking actions unilaterally, and basically he's isolating his allies. And not only that, we can see that, for example, like what Mr. Chen and Mr. Wang pointed out, he threatened to walk away from various institutions. In fact, he had withdrew from Paris Agreement and whatnot. And there is another very important military alliance, which is NATO. The US also actually threatened to say that they would walk away from NATO and express their interest in acquiring Greenland. So basically, Greenland is part of Denmark. And when the US insists that they want to acquire Greenland, even, not ruling out the possibility of military action, it actually caused a friction between NATO allies and Trump. And this actually led to Denmark and 7 other NATO allies to issue a joint statement which affirms Denmark's territorial integrity. So I can see that the decline is because people feel very disappointed with Trump and his various policy, the tariff policy, as well as, his insistence to take Greenland. So they feel like, their alliance with the US is very fragile and that can break up anytime soon. And for the ordinary people, they just feel like the US is like a big power that are sort of like bullying the other powers.
You have all mentioned U.S. allies. Actually, last year, among the 44 countries that saw the U.S.'s approval drop by over 10 points, most of them are U.S. allies, including many NATO partners. Let's move on to Mr. Wang. Could you please help us to delve deeper into why are people in the U.S. allies leading this decline in terms of U.S.'s approval drop?
I think allies, they judge the United States by a higher standard, right? I mean, rivals expect confrontations, but allies expect reassurance, continuity, and respect. So when Washington becomes more, transactional, more tariff-driven, or more casual about alliance sensitivities, the disappointment is sharper among friends than among adversaries. As you mentioned, Gallup poll says 44 countries saw a decline of at least 10 points concentrated among allies. And I think actually this poll can be corroborated by other polls, including the one conducted by European Council on Foreign Relations, which also shows that Europeans have been dealing with under renewed tariff pressure, growing doubts about U.S. security guarantees, and even anxieties over Trump's revived Greenland rhetoric toward Denmark. So that poll also found that only I think 16% of EU citizens now see the U.S. as an ally, and so this is not anti-Western sentiment. It is these allied publics, they are reassessing whether the United States is a dependable anchor.
Okay, and then Dr. Lee, what do you think? Why are people in the U.S. allies specifically more negative about the U.S.'s leadership?
Yeah, I think, well, like what we have discussed just now, I basically see that the US approval rating has dropped, and even their disapproval rating has actually increased in these NATO countries, particularly in Germany, Portugal. The reason is because I think all these policies of the United States is very much self-interested, and whatever measures or actions taken by the United States, it was never discussed with the allies. So in other words, I think the US didn't actually treat them as equal partners. The US have a very different worldview. They feel themselves as the single most powerful countries in the world, and therefore, in whatever they do, there's no need to actually discuss with the EU. So from the US EU perspective, they will like feel being isolated and even alienated by the US. And in fact, when we see what the US is trying to do is like what Mr. Wang said, is the current US administration is very transactional. They're asking or pressuring NATO partners to increase their military spending. And these are all these issues that arises that cause frictions between the NATO partners with the US. And for NATO partners, I think they were saying that the US would not be a reliable partner, and therefore there is even call for EU to have strategic autonomy, meaning to say that in future there is no need really to follow thoroughly whatever the US asked them to do, meaning they should have an independent and autonomy to decide on what is the best path for them. So for example, I think the US also has been pressuring the EU to sort of like contain China, in other words, but I think EU has to take this into consideration. I think the US, they could not be reliable security partner and also not a reliable economic partner. And who else can they look to besides China? I mean, China, cooperation with China would give them a lot of potentials and then a lot of drive growth. So therefore, I think the reasons why many NATO partners actually view US negatively is because of the issues of Greenland, because of pressuring them to increase military spending, and also mainly because of the tariff. And there is no coordinations in whatsoever with or special treatment for the EU NATO members.
Okay, and the pressure has also been felt by people in those U.S. allies. Now, among all the U.S. allies, there's a big exception, Israel. The Israeli people's approval of the U.S. is as high as 76%. It's one of the highest in the world. So, Mr. Chen, how do you explain this divergence between Israel and other U.S. allies?
As the other panelists mentioned, I think it was not surprising for U.S. allies to distance themselves from the U.S. because you just listen how Trump has trashed NATO, trashed the European Union, trashed various European leaders, and threatened to take over a piece of ice, which is Greenland. It was hugely offensive to Europeans. So that's no wonder. I mean, the poll among the Europeans are very low for Americans. I mean, besides, actually, the Europeans during the election, the last election, they 70%, more than 70% favored Biden over Trump, so which means they didn't like Trump in the first place. But going back to Israel, I think Israel is a very different case because I think actually one connected is, in the last the few years of the Biden administration, the first year of the Trump administration, you have this Gaza genocide going on. Europeans, many of them supported Israel, calling it the right to defend itself. Actually, they were also appalled by the atrocities conducted by Israel, so they opposed it, many of them. But the U.S. administration obviously continued to offer support, and that's also actually put European and Americans apart, I would say. And but for Israel, I think traditionally they favor Republican president more than a Democratic president, which means they favor Trump more than Biden. And but overall, the U.S.-Israeli relation is very special. I mean, I actually lived 11 years in the U.S. and covered, U.S. politics, and U.S. politicians like congressmen or even cabinet member before they swear in, they often have to pledge allegiance, loyalty to Israel before they pledge loyalty to the United States. That's quite bizarre, but that's so politically correct in Washington. So that's why you have University of Chicago professor John Mearsheimer writing the book called Israel Lobby, because the Israel is so influence is so powerful in Washington politics, and so I would say that Israel is not like U.S. allies in Europe.
But Israeli people's approval of the U.S. Fluctuated a lot during the past few years. It spiked after the October 2023 Hamas attack, and then it dropped sharply in 2024. Then it jumped back 13 points in 2025 when Trump returned to the White House. Let's move on to Mr. Wang. What does this back and forth tell us about what shapes a country's, or specifically Israel's, opinion of U.S. leadership?
I do think Israel is actually the clearest example of hard security overriding almost everything else. In most allied countries, people are evaluating the U.S. through trade friction, political style, multilateral withdrawal or alliance uncertainty. But in Israel, the U.S. is judged first and foremost through deterrence, military backing, intelligence sharing, regional crisis. Yeah, so I think in the case of Israel, the opinion of great powers can be highly event-driven. I think the spike and then the drop actually shows that, because the U.S. approval in Israel is not moving a smooth ideological line. It is reacting to whether Washington is seen as an immediately useful ally in moments of danger, as you mentioned, after the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas. And then, in 2024, and then after Trump returned to office in 2025, I think the pattern suggests that, Israeli people often judge leadership less by, in this case, when they are, in what Israel believes to be a very, hostile neighborhood. It's judged less by abstract principles than whether they feel, protected, backed, or abandoned in crisis. I think, this is truly a quite unique case compared with other U.S. allies.
And then, Dr. Li, the regions with most declines in U.S. approval also include countries of the Global South, including those in Africa and almost all of South America. So, Dr. Li, why do you think Global South countries are turning more negative?
Okay, before I answer this question, I just want to add on to what Mr. Chen said just now about the NATO allies distancing themselves from the U.S. administration. And actually, we see it's very true because I think recent event, the US actually asked NATO to join its coalition strikes against Iran, but then NATO basically just refused to do it. Particularly, I think what US wants NATO to do is to help to reopen the Straits of Hormuz, which the NATO did not agree to. Okay, so the Global South, I think, yes, it's not very surprising for the Global South to view the US very negatively. The reason, like we say, the Global South is like is still in the developing stages. So what they want is actually development. So they prioritize development. But what we're seeing is that Trump, with its tariffs, various types of tariffs, it's not only the universal tariff, he also have Section 301 tariff and many, many more tariff that it seems is going to hamper the economic development of the Global South. So, and not only that, when first Trump announced the universal tariff, he meant to pressure all these countries into entering unequal trade agreements, which actually forces all these countries to open up their economy to the US in exchange for lowering the tariff. Not removing the tariff, but just lowering the tariff. So a lot of, countries in the Global South, they basically entered into one trade agreement, which their people actually think is very unequal, which opens up their economy further to US companies and remove a lot of protections for their industries, which actually can hamper the competitiveness of their local industry. And one particular country, the people would particularly dislike Trump is Mexico. I think Mexico had a very rough time due to the tariff. Trump even openly criticized the Mexican leader. So the people were infuriated. And especially Mexicans, they were not really happy with Trump because US and Mexico actually has a free trade agreement. So with that free trade agreement, supposedly most of the goods should be exempted from tariff, but Trump tried to override it. So what happened was there was like a movement in Mexico where the cafes in Mexico, they were so angry with the US that they tried to rebrand the coffee Americano to be Mexicano. So this is a form of protest against Trump and all its policies.
Thank you all for your in-depth analysis so far. Let's have a short break. Coming back, we'll continue our discussion.
Hello, my name is Alessandro Golombiev Teixeira. I'm a professor of public policy and management at Tsinghua University in Beijing. I am a great listener of The World Today. In my opinion, The World Today is one of the best China radio programs. In The World Today, we can get the best news and analysis in what is happening now in the world. So please come to join us.
Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion of World Today with me, Hongyu. We've been unraveling global perceptions of China and the United States because a global poll has found that in 2025, China surpassed the United States in approval ratings of leadership and by the largest margin seen in nearly 2 decades. Let's now continue our discussion and let's move on to the China part. China's approval rating has gone up steadily from 28% in 2022 to 36% in 2025. So, Dr. Li, let's start with you this time. What factors are driving this continued growth in China?
Well, I think China image in the eyes of many countries are much better today. I think China is being perceived as a more reliable partner and friend. And very importantly, I think China, as a responsible power, is contrasting with what the America is doing. There are, like what Mr. Wang and Mr. Chen say, they are causing a lot of disruptions and also a lot of uncertainties to the world. So on the other hand, I think China is seen as a more responsible power that respects country sovereignty and also one that emphasizes on peaceful coexistence. So I think this is very important to drive China's approval rating because in particular, we see that the US, they have been involved in regime change in Venezuela, involved in Gaza war, involved in Iran war today. So therefore, I think many countries believe that now we cannot expect anything else from the United States. So we needed a more responsible and sensible power, and that is China. And one of the things I think China did right is that while the US is turning more inward, setting out high tariff that can stifle competition, China, on the other hand, say it will continue to defend the global trading system and also ensure that trade continues to flow more smoothly. I think this is very important. And China, which always call for a more just and equal international order, is something what other countries actually want as well.
More cooperation and more openness, more stability. And then, Mr. Chen, can we get your view here? What are the factors that are driving the continued growth of China's approval rating in the past few years?
Yeah, well, obviously the contrast. You have the U.S. becoming increasingly destructive, and China, has been seeing increasing a source of stability, as the others mentioned. China has obviously not waged the war, has not engaged in a military conflict with anyone since 1979, when there was a 3-week brief border conflict with Vietnam. China, international issue, China appears to be the adult in the room, obviously. You have U.S. threatening tariffs, and you have U.S., quitting international institutions. Tariff is very interesting, I would say. Before I came back from Europe, Europeans actually look at China's reaction to Trump's tariff threat. China stands up to the tariff threat, while Europeans kowtowed. They basically surrendered to Trump's threat. So I think you have many Europeans applauding China's response to Trump's tariff threat. So China stands very strong. And of course, China, I think, has been laser focused on doing a good job at home. If you look at China's performance, China is not a sort of a largest manufacturing powerhouse with labor-intensive goods. It's become, a technology leader, a renewable energy, EVs, you name it, I would say. Obviously, I hope, China's many visa-free policy, for many countries has also helped because it allowed more people to visit China. I'm not in Shanghai. You go outside in the city center, you see many more, foreigners. So obviously, more people are able to see the real China. I want to say this is especially important because the poll, shows such rising favorability for China because China has been demonized by the West for years, especially during the Biden administration. The first Trump administration too. They always want to portray China as a threat, destabilizing, which are all lies. But I have to acknowledge that actually the Trump 2.0, has dialed down on the rhetoric. Even, there are still a lot out there. But, I think all these factors, should more and more people recognize China is not what those lies say.
Great. And then, Mr. Wang, do you think that maybe soft power can be one of the reasons? Because this rating is not done by policymakers. It was done by ordinary people across the world. So do you think that soft power of China has something related to the result of China's growth?
Well, I do agree with what Ms. Chen Weihua just says. China has, reopened more confidently, expanded visa-free access, and basically made it much easier for business people and tourists to come. I think the overwhelming majority of EU member states, citizens can travel to China visa-free for 30 days at a time. And I think the Chinese government reported that, in last year, over 30 million foreign entries based on visa-free. So there is that, and also as I'm sure many people have seen on social media, on YouTube, on short video platforms, there are basically vloggers taking video records of what they see in China. So I do think that helps with the soft power part. But at the same time, I would be careful not to overstate it because 36% is still not overwhelming global enthusiasm. But the direction is meaningful. As has been said, the partly the increase is clearly a contrast. When the U.S. looks more erratic, China benefits from appearing steadier and more predictable. But there is, of course, the domestic Chinese substantive side of opening more. So I think for China, the key now is to deepen that openness and make foreign interactions with China warmer, easier, and just more reassuring. Yeah.
The momentum matters here. It is phenomenal that many of China's approval gains are in countries where the U.S.'s approval dropped, including U.S. allies like the UK, Spain, Italy, and Ireland. Mr. Chen, is this because people in these countries actively prefer China and agree with China's sense of values or China's way of development, or just because they're turning away from the United States?
Well, I think I would say both are true. I mean, obviously, we already talked about the U.S. allies are deeply frustrated with the U.S., the Trump administration. I mean, but they have become, the fact that actually Europeans talking about the de-risking from the United States, right, is quite telling, itself. Europeans have become much more realistic, pragmatic today with China. They were under great pressure before, under the Biden administration, the first Trump administration, to sort of joining their China containment strategy. But China they realize China is not the China 20 years ago, not even the China 10 years ago. China, as we mentioned, is the manufacturing powerhouse, technology leader, and the largest trade partner for some 130 countries. That's why you see Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez coming to China next week for the fourth time. In just a few years, and you have recently visits, to China by leaders from the UK, France, Germany, and Canada. All of which are key U.S. allies, or most G7 member states. So I think this is particularly important because China-EU relation, for example, used to be quite good, but it was deeply affected by sort of the geopolitical rivalry between China and the U.S. during the first Trump administration. So really hope, personally hope that, the EU is supposed to restart sort of as the China debate, but it's being postponed just for, I think, a little while. But they are just trying to re-engage with China. Obviously, I think the Pedro Sanchez visit and other leaders' visits are quite symbolic of the trend. European are coming closer to China. I wouldn't say, they used to say, we want to keep, we are not equal distance, a little closer to the U.S. But this time, I think maybe they are still closer to the U.S., but they're coming a little closer to China.
Re-engagement. And now, China's 5 percentage point lead over the U.S. is the biggest gap in China's favor in nearly 20 years, according to Gallup. Then, Dr. Li, what does this gap tell us about how the world is viewing these two countries' leadership today?
Well, I think meaning to say that the increase in favor of China, meaning that people have more trust and confidence in the Chinese leadership, whereas on the other hand, people are less confident and have less trust on the U.S. leadership. I think mainly people view these countries very differently. I think in the eyes of many, Trump's administration actually causes a lot of volatility and uncertainty. And for ordinary people, it actually affected their life as well. If we look at the current Iran war, it's actually sending oil prices out. And then it affected, ordinary people life because things are getting expensive. And even some countries in Asia, like Thailand, they run out of oil in the petrol station. So therefore, I think, of course, I knew that this pull was taken in 2025 before all these things happened. But even in 2025, with all his tariff and then with his promises and then withdraw from his promises, all this uncertainty and flip-flop policies actually makes people, think that view the US in a negative light. So I think, and another thing, very funny thing is that when Trump's, before he became a president, he said he's going to get the US out of war. But what we're seeing is the opposite. Like in last year, 2025, there were already strikes on Iran. There were also US heavy involvement in the Gaza war. So that's the opposite. And in fact, you see Trump through executive order, he renamed the Department of Defense to be Department of War. So is this administration that says he's going to take the US out of war or into more wars? So I think that, Trump, when he intervenes in many conflicts around the world, and specifically, for example, the majority Muslim populations, they will definitely view Trump negatively, and the US as an extension negatively, because of the US support for Israel. It caused the war in Gaza to be ongoing for so long. And we have seen, children, women killed, civilians killed as a result of this, bombardment. And therefore, I think it was a very different image that China actually portrays to the other world. And as what both other panelists have described, China has been championing, stability, has been giving more stability to the world, has been championing non-interference and peaceful coexistence. And not only that, when China, when there were hostilities elsewhere, for example, in Gaza, and what China's asked for is that there is an immediate end to the hostilities and that China promotes dialogue and discourages the use of force. And this presents a very different image of China and the United States. And I would say that there are other Chinese initiatives that actually helps to improve China's image. For example, there are BRI that helps promote economic development. There are also global development initiatives. So all of this makes China seems like a provider of security and economic development for the world.
Mm-hmm. And now there are a lot of different interpretations regarding the improving Chinese image and the worsening US ones. Some say that China's lead over the US is more because the US approval dropped, not because China's approval grew. So, Mr. Chen, do you agree with this explanation? Do you think this is the right way to put it?
Well, I would say not really, because you actually have other polls. I mean, from Pew Center, from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Actually, another poll released this week by Singapore think tank, which shows more people. I mean, in ASEAN, 11 ASEAN member states would rather align with China than align with the United States if they are forced to choose sides. That's quite amazing. So the trend is, I think, quite clear. I mean, actually, even the Gallup poll itself show in the last few years, I mean, the trend for China is on the rise. So, but I think this is going to be a permanent trend for quite a while. I mean, quite optimistic about that, because as we discussed so far, I mean, China has been the adult in the room, China being the source of stability. China is for a multipolar world. China actually, unlike what some Western politicians demonizing China supports the global system want to safeguard the global system that established since the World War II. I mean, of course, China and other developing country in the global south, like Brazil, India. I mean, obviously, we want to improve the global system to make our voices, the developing countries' voices, more heard. I mean, but we don't want to topple the international system, and that's been clear. I mean, so I think all this shows China has acted responsibly. Even if you just look what happened the last few years, I mean, they're all indicating that China has played a role in mediating, the current crisis between Iran and the U.S. and Israel. I mean, China obviously played a very positive role in rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia a few years ago. China has continually, called, China being always, to me, on the right side of history on this very important issue, whether on the Gaza, crisis, peace, and stability and economic development, So, coming back from Europe, China actually was the biggest savior, during the Euro crisis. If you go to Greece and ask people there, they will tell you that.
Okay. Then, Mr. Wang, we've been talking about public opinions on different major powers now. But do you think there's a gap between how ordinary people view the United States and China's leadership and how their governments, the policymakers, view these powers? If there is such a gap, how might it affect policy decisions?
Well, I do think, judging by, let's just say, the increasingly more frequent visits by foreign leaders to China that, as Ms. Chen was saying, there was a British prime minister, there was a German chancellor, the Spanish prime minister is coming here again next week, actually at the end of this week for the first time in 4 years. And then we will have the Vietnamese leader very shortly. So I'm pretty sure, like all these countries' leaders, they are visiting China for a reason. They feel the need to have more engagement with China, and I think that reflects broadly, with just as the poll, which is actually conducted among the people on the streets. And but however, I do think the relative confidence now do favors China more than before, but I would not go so far to say the world has become uniformly, pro-China, because neither country commands broad support, and both still have actually negative net approval globally, -1 for China and strikingly -15 for the U.S. And but of course, the U.S. leadership has become more polarizing than China's. The U.S. disapproval hit actually 48%, almost half. I guess the question now are no longer only about what used to be is just values or alliance. They are now more about predictability, development, market access, and the room for policy autonomy. On those questions, I think the U.S. did lose ground significantly to China. I think also the public are not suddenly become, pro-China in an ideological sense. They are become less willing to let, Washington or the traditional mainstream narrative monopolize their strategic choice. And the people, and also as the leaders of these countries, they are more willing to keep channels open with Beijing. So for China, this is an opportunity. And if it responds with more openness and fewer, frictions, we might see, even better polling numbers for China, in the next one.
A great chance for China. And public opinions can also affect market access or rules and business partnerships. It can affect a country's economy. Mr. Chen, what risks and opportunities does this current global sentiment create for multinational companies working across major powers?
Well, actually, if you look at the capital flow, you increasingly see, it's in favor of China, in favor of, for example, Hong Kong SAR, because of the turmoil. because China's been seen increasingly as a place of predictability. I mean, as Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, said actually China is more reliable and predictable than, the United States. Can you imagine that from, the northern neighbor of the United States? I mean, it's unthinkable just a few years ago. So I think business leaders, even in Europe, Germany, the largest European economy, they're talking about, actually one of the goals of the Spanish Prime Minister Sanchez's visit to China is actually, I read the reports about persuading China for technology transfer to Spain. I mean, you actually have heard this a lot recently from European leaders. Did you hear that 10 years ago, 20 years ago? No, we always have European transferring their technology. But now, because China is a technology leader, and China obviously is the huge, huge market in this world. So business, China is also sending, the 15th five-year plan, Chinese leaders have been sending out, opening up, policies, welcoming foreign investors. So I think it's all good. China is a place of stability. It welcomes the investors, and it's a great market. It's a great opportunities. So I think it's look quite good, in favor of China.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Dr. Li, given what has happened so far this year and what might happen in the coming months, how will the global images of China and the United States change this year?
I think there will be, of course, more resentment towards the U.S. leadership because of its involvement in, for example, regime change in Venezuela. And then we see that the strikes against Iran. And in fact, in Gaza war, Trump comes up with its 20-point plan, which actually enrages the Palestinian because the plan, it seems to actually favors the Israeli more than the Palestinian. So I would say I expect the approval rating of the U.S. to decline further, particularly in majority Muslim countries like in Malaysia. In fact, in Malaysia, when the Gaza war happened, there was boycott of the American products because people associate these brands, American brands, with their support towards the U.S. involvement in the Gaza war. So therefore, I think that particularly in Muslim majority countries, the approval rate of the United States is going to decline further. And in the case of Asia as well, I think we felt most because of the recent conflict in Iran. Majority of the oil that passes through the Straits of Hormuz is actually to Asia. So I think in Asia as well, it will decline further. And for China, I think China has been building efforts to be close to countries across different regions, particularly in Southeast Asia. Like, for example, I gave you an example during COVID-19. China actually gave, quick access to some of the countries in Southeast Asia. They even donated some of the vaccines to Southeast Asia countries to help the countries to, quickly vaccinate its people. And these are some things that, the people can feel. It's a form of public diplomacy because they know, okay, the donations are coming from China. And then there is also BRI project, and specifically in Malaysia, we have this East Coast Rail Link, which is going to be in operation very soon. So people will it's everywhere. This kind of initiative driven by China, which is beneficial for the countries. So people, truly understand that. And of course, I think in this year, Chinese image will definitely, approval rating will definitely be much better in Asia and in Muslim majority places. And on the other hand, the U.S. Approval rate in Muslim majority countries will definitely decline further.
And then, Mr. Wang, what do you think? What's your forecast or the evaluation of the global images of China and the United States in 2026?
Well, I think it depends on what these two countries do and how people view them. But we're now in the early part of April. I think Yeah, I would agree with what Dr. Li Pei Mei was just saying, that it doesn't look very well for the United States. And I want to add one more thing, which I think so far hasn't been mentioned, is within the United States, the internal governance, the domestic internal chaos also shape outsiders' perception of the United States. I guess it's not just the U.S. foreign policy choices, its military intervention, its attack on Iran, its invasion into Venezuela, but also into the within the United States itself. There was huge no king protests. There was a huge change in the U.S. military in the also among its diplomatic corps. And I think people are also watching the domestic developments in the United States. And for China, if it sticks to the road of more openness, better development, sharing opportunities, sharing technology, sharing production capacity with the rest of the world, and welcoming more people, including from the United States, to enter China. Trump is coming to China, at least he says so, next month. So if China continues down this more openness road, I do see the comparative approval rating for China in the eyes of the global community would get better.
Okay, thank you. And that's all for this edition of World Today. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.